Hi, Scotty Elcon with Selig Film News. We're here with the team behind Most Likely to Succeed, Greg Whiteley and Ted Dintersmith. Greg, you go education, MIT, and then education again. What made you dive back into this, realm? I mean, I know the debate stuff was a little different.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I never thought of the debate film as an education film, but Ted did. I mean, you saw it resolved and felt like it was hitting on a lot of the issues that he cares about. The idea for this film came from Ted. And so I was working to finish MIT when I met Ted, and Ted had come to this idea, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know if a documentary film came to you 6 or 7 years ago, but your idea of wanting to fix
probably.
education in this country.
Yeah, and so I called him. I did a bunch of reference checks, and I got several people in a row almost saying, the one guy you should call is Greg Whiteley. So I call him out of the blue. We talk, he's in Sacramento, and I lay out for him this really brilliant view of a documentary I want him to do. And he says, not only will I not do that documentary for you, but if somebody does, you're really gonna hate the film. And I said, right away, I said, I like this guy. Because what he explained to me was that if you just have talking heads making lecture points, it ends up being a really boring documentary. And so he said, trust me to find a story. I think I'm really great at this. I mean, Greg's modest, but from his films, you could tell he's really great at it. He said, just point me in the right direction, trust me to find the story, and I think we can put together something that's really great. And that's exactly the game plan we had, and I think he absolutely came through.
What made you switch your mind then?
Well, I think backing up and what Ted was proposing, and this happens a lot, that there's people, Ted's being modest, he's made a whole pile of money and could do what a lot of people do with that pile of money, just go retire on an island somewhere or play golf, and instead he's really devoted his life to thinking about the issue of education. He's become convinced, or he became convinced, I've become convinced, that if you really wanted to solve a lot of the world's problems, you really should start there. Because if we could start empowering young people, particularly young people in our country, given all the advantages that we at least currently have, if you could begin to empower them with the types of skills that will allow them to maneuver more effectively in the 21st century, and if you can just think of a whole generation of kids that have heightened critical thinking skills, or heightened creativity, or a heightened ability to collaborate and have empathy. I mean, these kinds of, if we can develop a generation that have those kinds of skills on par with the kind of industrial skills that we had in the 20th century, the problems that we face that seem just unsolvable, I believe, start to become solvable.
Do you think, you guys delve into the history of where the system came from, especially, can you talk to us about maybe that factory system that was starting in all other industries at the time led maybe to the school system becoming sort of a factory assembly and just churn the kids through, and then the idea of testing was just simple. Oh, now it's an easier way to really churn them through, and no one's ever done what you guys are proposing, which is, hey, let's actually teach these kids and allow them to think, is that how our school system screwed up?
And this was shocking to me. I didn't know this before I met Ted. And once we decided we were going to make a film, we began researching, where do our current school system come from? There's a lot of people that have written on this topic, but so a lot of the things that we take for granted in schools, the fact that we have a bell that ushers in the beginning of a class and the end of a class. The fact that these schools, you learn math or science in one room, and then you're shuffled down a conveyor belt to another room where you learn biology. I mean, these are things that we just think, well, that's just school, because for the last 120 years, that's what school has been. But that model was specifically designed to meet the needs of the Industrial Revolution. You had people like Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, Whitney. These people right in the late 1800s are seeing, okay, look, we are no longer needing to produce farmhands. We need to be producing people who can follow instructions, people that can read and write and do basic math. By the way, we don't need people to think critically that are working on an assembly line. The idea of being creative or thinking critically, that gets in the way of being a good factory worker. So let's design a curriculum that focuses almost exclusively on those skills that will allow them to be great factory workers. Now, along the way, if somebody develops a real passion for philosophy or calculus, well, by all means, we'll shuffle them up to higher education and they can become managers or middle managers or whatnot. But for everybody that's going to get a K through 12, and it was an amazing thing what they did. We were the first nation in the whole world to take everybody, regardless of class, eventually regardless of gender, and give them a basic education. And as a result, for 100 years, nobody could keep up with us in terms of a workforce. It won us 2 world wars. It produced an economy that was second to none. But we find ourselves now, 124 years later, with the exact same school system. And in 1983, we were really nervous because we were seeing other countries beginning to catch us economically. We were struggling economically as a country. Our schools seemed to be failing. And we were faced with a choice in 1983. And our film touches on this briefly. But the choice was, do we reassess our schools, given that we're starting to see a new economy emerge, where blue-collar jobs are going away, and what's going to be left? Do we now need to retool our school system, or do we just double down on the old model? Make the old model, keep it the same, retool it, maybe make it harder, but we're going to keep it fundamentally the same. And we kept it fundamentally the same. And as a result, we're graduating kids now from college that have a 53% chance of being unemployed.
Or in a minimum wage type job.
Or in a job they could have just as easily found had they'd skipped school altogether.
Wow. Ted, what makes you so passionate about this, though? What was that moment where you realized, I've got to step in, I've got to reach out to people like Greg, I've got to help this education system change? I know you've had it for decades, but I mean, where was it?
For me, there were 2 pivotal moments. I mean, one was having spent my career in venture capital backing entrepreneurs. You know, I in some way understood the fact that a lot of the productivity enhancing advances at the same time were putting people out of work. But I had a breakfast with a friend one day, and he came in and said, we just made a new investment. We backed this company called Harvest Automation. We're going to automate with robotics all the people that move plants around in landscape nurseries. I said, my gosh, if that's a fragmented business area, there are minimum wage jobs. I mean, if those jobs are under attack, what jobs aren't? And so that crystallized a view that if a job just requires you to follow instructions, that job will be done by something computational instead of something human going forward. So that was the first thing. And then the second was really just initially with my kids and then evolving to more and more schools that I visited, seeing that school, I initially said, gee, it's almost as though it were designed to crush the creativity out of kids. And then when you start looking at the history, you realize there's no almost in that statement. That actually was. And so what I would say to friends at dinner parties is, I'd say, look, you're sitting next to me. If you want to talk to me in an hour, I'll make sure you never look at your kid's school the same way again. And if you don't want that to happen, talk to somebody else. And over, people would call me back and say, I can't look at anything the same way. It really isn't what I thought it was. And so we sort of felt like if we could do that, if I could do it inarticulately in a dinner conversation, if I got, one of the world's most outstanding documentarians to put together a film, what would that do? And I think we're seeing that kind of traction. This film is having a response. I think it's off the charts in terms of how people are responding to it. You've had more film festival experience than I have by far, but our Q&As typically go an hour to 2.5 hours. People are so...
But only if you want them to.
But we do, because they're really great points.
Well, I'm curious then, Greg, because Ted mentioned something, family is an interesting, this is something that impacts families. Can you talk about, is there a personal view that you have of wanting to correct the system now? I know you've got young kids, how has that impacted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Ted's pitch to me, Ted is this amazing investor. He's somebody that places a huge amount of trust in the filmmaker and is, he meets all the great qualifications of an investor, wealthy, smart, supportive, and also just kind of knows...
Pushover.
Not a pushover. All right, well, yeah, great. But and so I would be interested in working with Ted on almost anything, on any topic. But for me, at this particular time, I've got a son who's he just turned 14. A daughter just turned 12. When we began making the film, she was 10. My son was 12. And my daughter in 4th grade at 10 years old was really struggling with school. From kindergarten through 3rd grade, she was the top student in her class, frequently the highest score in math, frequently winning the spelling bee. And then in 4th grade, it was like a light just went off, and she suddenly just was not interested in school. And you start thinking about that. And in my mind, the way that I looked at education, I was projecting 10, 15 years into her future, and I just imagined her homeless and all the things that parents worry about when somebody doesn't do well in school. So Ted's pitch came at a perfect time for me to think about education. And as I began reading some of the materials that Ted was sending me, as I began visiting some of the schools that Ted wanted me to go and visit, that him and another man named Tony Wagner had come across in their travels, I just began to see education in a totally different light. And as I would come home and be with my daughter and be with my son, it just felt so urgent to get this message out, finish this film, and to think thoroughly through these issues, which I think don't just affect kids or even just parents. They affect all of us. I mean, if you, this point has been made before, but if our education system fails in this country, think of all the ways, all the different things that start to go south. That generation is going to be people, they're going to be the same people who are running big companies. They're going to be the people that are voting. It's going to be the people who they're voting for. And if you haven't taught them to think critically, think creatively, have empathy, all of these skills that we now know to be absolutely integral to the 21st century success, where will we be as a country?
It's a little scary, definitely. Yeah. To kind of personalize it to Dallas, Dallas, we have a wide range of schools. We've got Highland Park, which is on the upper echelon of all schools in the whole country.
I filmed there
Exactly.
when we made Resolved.
But we also have, DISDs struggling right now, and those schools are having difficulties. Can y'all talk to me about how do you change not only the mindset of schools, but maybe the finances to change that? And can you point it towards Dallas, since you do have experience here?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that typically the strategy to fix schools has been try and take inner city schools and raise them so that they match the performance of your rich white suburban schools. So here in Dallas, probably a typical strategy is find these inner city schools and say we want them one day to be as good as Highland Park. We don't necessarily think that's a great strategy.
Yeah. I think what you find is that if you look at the typical school day across all sorts of schools, and we have visited the uber expensive private schools, and we visited schools with very few financial support systems. And what you see over and over again is kids are memorizing things, try to retain it just to get through the test and then forgetting it. And that oftentimes the schools that people think are great are just better at getting kids to buckle down, memorize, and forget. And so those kids, actually, when you think about them, they're going through the most important formative years of their life, and they're really being conditioned that life is all about jumping through meaningless hoops to please somebody else, instead of finding something you think is important and doing it. And so if you looked at an education strategy broadly, but let's take Dallas, do you want to ensure that all kids get the same bad education, which I think is largely national policies and many state policies? It's like we say, let's just test and measure enough and close the gap so that every kid has fair and equal access to the same bad education. Or do you want to have kids doing things that really matter, that are of consequence, where they develop skills that are relevant in life? And what we find is that if the metric of success in a school is something artificial, like do you know more vocabulary words than most adults use? Or can you factor polynomials quickly under time pressure? Those Highland Park kids are going to do really well, mainly because they're in homes that use lots and lots of vocabulary words, and they're going to have parents that sit on them and say, darn it all, you're going to get good at factoring polynomials. If you switch it and said, can you be creative? Can you be resourceful? Can you be innovative? Will you persevere till you get it done? A lot of times, and I can't speak specifically to Dallas, but what we find is a lot of times those kids in the quote-unquote great schools are incredibly fragile kids. That if you put them out of the element of just jumping through hoops and into the area of trying to actually take on something you believe in and you're passionate about, iterate and solve it, they fall apart. And oftentimes the kids in the bad schools are the ones that, if that were the figure of merit in education, would thrive, would do incredibly well. And so instead we had this drumbeat that just keeps going back and back and back to the kids in these in the tougher neighborhoods that say, oh, you're average or you're below average because you don't know what ostentatious means, and because you don't memorize the quadratic equation. And I think in many ways we're just trying to say, wait a minute, let's have what we're asking kids to be good in school at be aligned with what's important in life. And so we found that the reaction to our film's been really stunning in the sense of, a lot of times, this is really heartening for me, a lot of times the people that come up afterwards and tell us how much they love the film are not the audience members, but I was at a screening, the bartender and the waitress came up afterwards and said, we couldn't stop watching this film. We struggled in school, but we feel like we're really good at the things you articulate. We wish we had seen this film when we were younger. You know, and it's like you realize, wait a minute, why is it that we have this sense that what's learned in a narrow academic context is really valuable high-level learning, and what's learned practically when you're actually doing things and accomplishing things and creatively solving problems is discounted. And what we really are saying, and what you see in the film, is kids that are working on stuff they believe in. They have a sense of purpose, and they're getting good at collaboration and creative problem solving and critical analysis and communication. And you just sort of say, what's going to matter in the long run?
When we, because of Ted's career, we had access to a number of CEOs, people who were working, the vice president at Google, Cisco, different people, different companies up in Silicon Valley. And the reason why it was important in our film to go and speak with these people was that it doesn't take a lot of, you know, to be a genius to realize that's where jobs are going to be coming from in the 21st century. And when you spoke with them, they would say over and over again, when we looked at kids that had come from the very best high schools and then gone on to the very best universities and graduated at the top of their class, and when they come to us, frequently they were incapable of doing the work we needed them to do. And there were a couple of key ways that these people would fall short. One of them Ted articulated. If they've gone through the best schools and they've graduated at the top of their class, they've never failed. Because in our school system, if you fail, that ushers you down a different path. You don't get into Yale if you have an F in a class or if you failed on an assignment. You don't graduate the top of your class from Stanford if somewhere along the line you have completely bungled something. And so what happens is you weed out a number of kids who are real risk takers, that have kind of an entrepreneurial spirit and don't mind trying something and failing and then keep trying at it. And as a result, you get a ton of kids who probably chose a fairly safe and predictable route, probably studied something that was pretty safe and predictable. So by the time they get to Laszlo Bock at Google, say, they're sitting across from someone that is not in touch with what they're passionate over. They've long since jettisoned that ambition, or even asking themselves that question, what is it that I really love? That's not even on the table. It's more like, well, what is it that the teacher wants and how can I give it to them? So when you get into the real world and all of a sudden you've got an employer like Google or like Cisco or like any other startup or any other company for that matter, and somebody comes in and says, hey, I've got a problem. You're perfect. You've got this MBA, you graduate at the top of your class, you've never received anything less than an A. Take on this problem. And frequently these kids would look at this problem and turn back to the employer, their boss, and say, great, I can't wait to get started on this. Can you tell me how to do it? And as we looked at some of these companies that have completely revamped their hiring practices, whereas Google's a perfect example. They no longer require a college diploma. They say that the #1 predictor of success at their company is not how well you did in school, that there's zero correlation between how well you did in school and how good an employee you are. The #1 predictor of success is if you started a company before you got there. Regardless of whether the company succeeded or not. That's the #1 predictor of success.
Wow. Well, I mean, kind of final question, Greg, then, how do we turn most likely to just succeeding?
That's, I love the way you phrased that. First off, we spend a lot of time in our film highlighting a school in San Diego that we discovered in our travels. We visited probably 20 schools in making this movie. For just pure entertainment and narrative purposes, we chose one. We chose a great one. But we're very careful to say that this should not be the template for now all schools. I think what we need to realize as a country in our education system is that all kids learn differently. They're infinitely different. There, as a result, should be many different ways, not just many different kinds of schools in our country, but there should be many different kinds of curriculums and assignments within those schools. And it's a bit of a challenge, but curiously, it's not a challenge that's going to require more money in education to fix. It's going to require giving teachers greater autonomy to customize and design and create curriculums that meet the needs of individual students. And then I think the second thing that needs to happen is just to have parents, teachers, educational thought leaders in a particular community just ask one question. What are the skills that we really want kids to have? And then work backwards from there. I'm convinced if you just go through that exercise, we'll start creating all kinds of different schools. Right now we have one kind of school, and it was invented 124 years ago. And for the most part has not changed a bit. We retool it some, we test it differently. Sometimes we lengthen the school day, but it's largely the same. And the skills that they're measuring are the same, and those skills, the problem is those skills are obsolete. It's no longer important to be able to memorize a bunch of facts and then give them back to the teacher exactly the way that they were given. That was for a different age.
Well, Greg, I know we're really excited to have your film here as part of the festival, so thank you, and thank you for coming.
We're thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
Ted.
thank you.